Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to be talking about my latest novel, Beautiful Little Fools, in conversation with my friend, Mary Kubica. And I'm going to introduce her, and then I'm going to let her get started. Mary is the New York Times bestselling author of 7 suspense novels, which are all amazing. I'm a huge fan of hers. Her novels have been selected as Indie Next and Library Reads Picks, have been nominees in the Goodreads Choice and Strand Critics Award, and her latest, Local Woman Missing, is currently a finalist for an Audio Award. Her novels have been translated into over 30 languages and have sold over 2 million copies worldwide. A former high school English teacher, Mary lives outside of Chicago with her husband and 2 children. And thank you for being in conversation with me, Mary.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here, Jillian. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. And for those of you out there joining us that have not read Beautiful Little Fools yet, you have to get it. You have to order it here from Barbara's Bookstore. It's just such a phenomenal book. So I'm so excited to be talking to you about this tonight. So I'm going to start by introducing Jillian, and then we're going to dive into some questions. And for anybody that's with us tonight, if you have a question for Jillian, there's the little ask a question box at the bottom of your screen. So you can just go in there and pop a question, and we'll get to your questions in a little bit. But Jillian Cantor has a BA in English from Penn State University and an MFA from the University of Arizona. She is the USA Today and internationally best-selling author of 11 novels for teens and adults, which have been chosen for Library Reads, Indie Next, Amazon Best of the Month, and have been translated into 13 languages. Jillian's most recent novel, Beautiful Little Fools, was published on February 1st, 2022, and as of today is a national indie bestseller. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Born and raised in a suburb of Philadelphia, Cantor currently lives in Arizona with her husband and 2 sons. So this book, Beautiful Little Fools, is just, it's amazing. I mean, all of your books are amazing, Jillian. And I mean that. Every time I pick up a new book of yours, I just can't put it down. It's so immersive and transporting, all of your books, and just so beautifully written. So I was really excited to get my hands on this one a couple of months ago. But just to get started tonight, do you want to tell us a little bit about Beautiful Little Fools?
Sure. And thank you. And thank you for the kind words. And I have to say, as I mentioned in your bio, I'm a huge fan of yours. And I think I read The Good Girl before I met you, and I was gushing the first time we met. So thank you so much for doing this with me. Beautiful Little Fools is a reimagining of the world of The Great Gatsby, but it's told from the women's points of view. And it takes place before and during and after the original novel. And it's kind of part mystery, part retelling, and part historical novel that details the lives of these women at the time. And it's sort of recast as a murder mystery. I have a detective character who's investigating Jay Gatsby's murder, and he thinks that one of 3 women are involved, and you get to see their 3 stories leading up to and after the murder as the detective investigates.
So good. And that's what, there's that mystery that's kind of laced throughout the whole story, but then you have this like immersive experience into the Great Gatsby and the lives of these characters, which is that mystery like lingering there under the pages all the time. I love it. It just kept me turning the pages to figure out, what happens. So right away when I started reading this, though, it like struck me that this is the first book of yours that it's historic, but it's based on a fictional novel as opposed to, a historical event or person from history. So it's different from your books in that regard. So I'm curious, what that writing experience was like and what made you want to, do this reimagining of a fiction novel and why The Great Gatsby.
Well, I've always loved The Great Gatsby. From the first time that I read it in high school, I think it was the first book I was ever assigned to read that was a classic that I just truly enjoyed and just wanted to read. And then I read it again in college. I was an English major, so I was in an English class and we read it, and I actually kept my college copy. I still have it here from 1995, I think. And it traveled with me across the country and from house to house when I moved. And I think most of the rest of my college books I don't still have, but I have The Great Gatsby. And I would come back to it and reread it every year or two. And I always I loved it as a reader the first time, but then I started to love it as a writer, as I started to write myself. And I feel like it's such a slim book. It's easy to read. Every sentence is beautiful, but it's also this just like piece of this American life and American time and history. And I always loved F. Scott Fitzgerald's choice to narrate the book from the point of view of Nick, who's an outsider. He's not in this crowd. And I always thought that was so interesting as a writer, you know, why he made that choice. But every time I read it, I would think a lot about the women in the story. And the women are so involved in the plot. Everything about the plot revolves around the women. I mean, Jay Gatsby moves to West Egg because he's still in love with Daisy. And, you know, Tom's cheating on Daisy with Myrtle, and Myrtle gets murdered. And that's why Jay Gatsby gets murdered. And so it's so much about the women, but the women barely speak. And we never really know what they're thinking. So I kind of always thought about them as I would read the book, and, you know, wanted to know more about them. And so finally, I decided in order to know more about them, I had to write about them myself. So it was a really fun experience to do it. And you're right, it was different from my other books, a lot of which were, you know, either about real people or based on real events. But it felt sort of the same in a way. And I keep on having to catch myself, because I'll be talking about like Daisy from Gatsby versus my Daisy, and I keep saying, well, the real Daisy, and then I'm like, well, no, like the original fictional Daisy, because she really feels sort of like a real person. So the experience of writing it wasn't that much different, I would have to say, except that most of my research was reading and rereading and rereading again The Great Gatsby, and sort of going through it line by line and picking pieces out of it.
Yeah. So how did you do that then? You know, how did you balance? And you do such a phenomenal job with these four women. You know, we hear from the four women, and then we also hear from the detective in this book. So you've got a good number of voices, but with four women, all their voices are so distinct. And, you know, the women themselves are so distinct. But how did you balance, you know, the characters that that Fitzgerald's created with, you know, kind of your own, what you envisioned for these characters?
So before I started, I went through The Great Gatsby line by line, like I said, and I made a big outline. The Great Gatsby itself only takes place in the summer of 1922. I think it's like 3-month time period when they're in East Egg and West Egg. But they talk about what they were doing from 1917, just in little mentions here and there where they lived. I mean, we know Daisy and Jordan lived in Louisville, and they were friends, and they grew up down the street from each other. And that's where they met Jay. And, you know, we know when Daisy married Tom Buchanan, and we know where they went on their honeymoon. And we know that they moved to France, and then they moved to Chicago, and then they moved to East Egg. So there were all these little mentions, and I sort of went through and made a timeline for myself based on that. And I did stick to the timeline that he laid out in the original book. Every place that they go in my book is, you know, what F. Scott Fitzgerald mentioned in The Great Gatsby. So I started there. And then I also looked at pieces of dialogue for little character points, and, you know, use that to figure out what my characters were going to do and where they were and what they were thinking. And you know, there's just one line that really sticks out and really helped me form almost all of Jordan's character. But it's in the party scene at the plaza at the end of The Great Gatsby. They're all in the plaza. It's extremely hot outside. They're all drinking, and they suddenly start talking about Daisy and Tom's wedding. And Jordan says, sort of out of nowhere, that a man fainted at the wedding because it was so hot. They carried him down the street to her house because she lived just 2 doors down. And then she said he stayed for 3 weeks until Daddy threw him out, and then Daddy died the next day. And then they just move on with the conversation. And so I was like, that really shaped so much about Jordan, and thinking about her relationship with her father and what happened in those 3 weeks, and, you know, why that was significant for her life. So that was like a driving factor for her story. And there were just little lines like that here and there that sort of helped me figure everyone out. Catherine, who's one of my 3 point of view characters, is Myrtle's younger sister. She's barely in the original Great Gatsby. We see her twice. One time they go to a party at the apartment that Tom rents in the city for Myrtle. And Catherine's there, and we see her briefly in that scene. It's the scene where Tom breaks Myrtle's nose. If people remember the original book, Catherine is there. And then we see her again at the end of the book after Myrtle's died. She's identifying the body, and they ask her if Myrtle was into anything strange, or anything strange was going on, and she lies and says no. And so that's all we see of Catherine. We know she has red hair in a bob, and she's Myrtle's younger sister. And so for her, I took those little details about her appearance, and I definitely put her in those 2 scenes. But I also felt like I had a lot of leeway to make Catherine my own. So she was the one I think I sort of veered from, what the original intention might have been the most.
Yeah. Well, okay. I love that. After reading the book, I have to say, and then listening to you describe this, it just like it's, I don't know, it's such a cool experience to hear that, because it's been many years since I read The Great Gatsby. I think I was in college too, and there may be an old copy somewhere on these shelves behind me, but I don't have, like the greatest memory of it. And so hearing, these details, because obviously your book is so much more fresh in my mind. So to hear, these details that you pulled from The Great Gatsby and then brought into this book it's just so cool. And I love, how you took those little bits of information that you got from The Great Gatsby about these characters like Catherine, and then just like flesh them out so much, because she is like such a living, breathing character in your book. She's just such a strong character. And I mean, these women that you have, they're so different. You have a couple women here that are just in really happy or just really not good marriages. You have Catherine, who's like a suffragette, and she's, like really pushing the boundaries. And you have Jordan, who's like this golf pro, and there's a lot of other things that you introduce with her too, the readers will become familiar with. And it's just such a great portrayal of just all these different women in that era.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And I mean, the women were all pulled from, from the original in one way or another, but it was a really fun experience to go through and take out what we know and then sort of make them fully formed. I always wanted to know more about them. And I think people always ask me writing advice, and I always say, write the story that you want to read. And I took my own advice in this case, and that was what I did. And it was extremely fun.
Yeah. Well, and I think that it's one of the things that I've always loved about your writing is that, like, I love history. I used to teach history. Yeah. But you make it so accessible, because sometimes like in some of your books, you have like the fictional events, but you've introduced, the historic event, but you've introduced these fictional characters that as a reader, we can relate to and kind of get this grip on history in a way that you don't pick up in the textbooks and things like that. And so I think with Beautiful Little Fools, even though it's based on this fiction novel, I felt like I just got this greater sense of American literature, but also just what life was like in the 1920s. So I totally appreciated that.
Yeah.
What kind of research did you have to do, like beyond The Great Gatsby and these characters that you pulled from the story and like the facts that you pulled from the story? What did you have to do just on like life in the 1920s?
Yeah, I mean, a lot was actually in the original book. So there was a lot of great detail in there, but I did do research about the time period for sure. I read one nonfiction book that's called Careless People, and it's about the murder that F. Scott Fitzgerald might have actually based The Great Gatsby on, but it had a lot of really great details about the time, down from like what color everyone was wearing, in which year, to like what New York looked like at the time. And then I did a lot of just like little research about the places. I knew where they went. I knew they went to Santa Barbara and they were at the Santa Barbara Hotel. And I knew where they were in France, and I knew where they were in Chicago. And so just looking at pictures of what those places looked like at that time, and trying to imagine, where they would have been and what was going on in Louisville, and Daisy and Jordan were there. And I really fell down the research rabbit hole about the 1918-1919 pandemic, because when I first started writing this book, I actually didn't think about that at all. It was before our own pandemic. I had like 50 pages before the pandemic, and I had sold the book, and I had to write the rest. And I was doing that in the spring of 2020. And I was like, wait, my characters are in 1918 and 1919. I have to talk about this flu pandemic. So I spent like a week like outlining the whole flu pandemic, which was probably not a healthy thing to do at that time. But I learned that it really came in waves, and it was, regionally, it was worse at some times and other times. And so there was never a month where my book was taking place where the pandemic was having a wave, because it was only like certain pieces of those years. And so I was like struggling to figure out how to get all this information I learned about it in. And in the end, I think there's one line where Jordan says that some of her golf tournaments got delayed because of the flu scare, as she calls it. And then I also thought, well, Daisy and Jordan are very like self-centered. They're probably not thinking about it that much if it's not affecting them in that moment. So in the end, I didn't even put that in the book, but I spent a really long time learning about it. And I know a lot about it now.
Right. Well, I'm guessing with anything historical fiction, that's probably like one of those things that happens. You end up doing all this research for something that, like makes a line into the book. And I think that that's one of the things, just, you do such a phenomenal job of it, of, when you include the history, it's never like an information dump. You just feel as a reader like you're there and you're living this experience with the characters. So I love that. You make it so like effortless to just be transported and to absorb that history through your characters. And it's just phenomenal.
Yeah,
So,
it does. I think that happens with, it happens with every book. And I'm sure that happens with you too, that, even if you're not writing historical fiction, you go to look something up and then you go down the rabbit hole and then like one line ends up in the book. Cause I think we try to learn as much as we can. And sometimes I'm in the spot where I'm like, it's really interesting. But then I realize, well, the reader doesn't need to know this, so I can't include it. And I get sad.
Right. Like I want to write pages and pages about this epidemic, but
no, I did not want to at that point. I wanted to escape from the pandemic. So, I mean, honestly, Daisy and Jordan and Catherine were a really good escape when I was writing.
For sure. So of the characters, and I'm sure that this is like picking a favorite child, but did you have one that you liked the most or just that you connected with the most when you were writing them?
Yeah, I would say Jordan. I mean, Jordan was always my favorite, even in the original. And I just felt like Jordan was so strong and so passionate. And, she's this woman making her way in a man's world. She's a professional golfer, in like 1920 as a woman. And I just think that it took so much strength to do that. And I feel like she has the most fascinating storyline too, that I found relatable. So she was always really fun. I would get really excited when I was going to write Jordan. I mean, I did love all the women, but when I got to a Jordan chapter in the morning, it was always like, oh, I get to spend the day with Jordan.
And she, they all really spoke to me. I felt sorry for Daisy and for Myrtle a lot of the times, just for the situations that they were in. And Jordan and Catherine, I just loved how they were like pushing the limits a little bit, kind of in different ways. But it was fun to see, women you be able to do things like, then different than kind of what I imagine women were doing in the 1920s. It was just really inspiring to see these characters, going out there doing things, pushing the limits and kind of fighting for some rights that other women didn't have.
Yeah. And Catherine was really fun too. She was definitely like my close, and I love Daisy, but we know so much about Daisy from The Great Gatsby, and a lot of what happens to Daisy is kind of tragic. And she wants to find her voice and she wants to find happiness. And I think that I gave her a path to that she didn't have in The Great Gatsby, but just, a lot of what happens to her is kind of awful. Catherine was always really like fighting for women's rights. And I think there's one line where I have her say that she wanted to be someone. She didn't want to be someone's wife. She wanted to be someone. And I loved that about her personality too.
Yeah. It's just so great. So what's the whole process like for you? I mean, I have to say for those of you that don't know, Jillian is like one of the most prolific writers that I've ever met because not only does she write her adult historical fiction novels, but she writes young adult novels too. So, so first of all, let me go to that question. How is writing a historical fiction book for adults, how is it different than writing your YA novels?
It's not really that different. I feel like any novel, I just am sort of like connecting with the voice at the time and writing that person's story, and whether the person is like 16 or, in their 20s in the 1920s, it sort of all feels the same when I'm in the process. My young adult novels are not historical. So there is less research involved, although actually my most recent young adult novel is a retelling. So in some way that was very similar to how I went about the process for writing Beautiful Little Fools. That's a retelling of Emma set in modern day high school. So it was like, it felt similar to write it, I guess. So the process itself isn't that much different.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you get an idea, just to go through your process. So you get an idea, and then like how long do you outline? Are you an outliner, or I'm guessing with the amount of research you do, like you're definitely probably more detail oriented than I am.
No,
But
okay. So I like people always ask writers if we're a plotter or a pantser, right? And I always say that I'm a pantser, which I am, which means that I fly by the seat of my pants and don't outline. But with Beautiful Little Fools, I had an extensive outline, and I felt like I had to because I wanted to make sure it fit with the original. So I started off, I was like, I'll just make a small outline, but then it turned into a detailed outline. And I had like a chapter by chapter synopsis by the time I was done with this outline. And I actually stuck to it the whole time when I wrote, which was an amazing experience. It's like, I feel like I should do it all the time. Although I have to say the book I'm working on now, I didn't outline at all. So I don't know. I can't do it all the time, but I did outline all of Beautiful Little Fools. And then everything stayed as it was. And I turned the first draft into my editor, and she read it, and she was like, "You're missing the last chapter." And I was like, no, I went by my outline, and that was the last chapter in the outline. But she was like, "No, you need another chapter." And I realized she was right, but I was like so fixated on my outline, and I had finished the outline that it took me a minute. Yeah, so everything in the book is as I outlined it, except for the last chapter, which I wrote after my editor read the first draft. And she was totally right. And I love the last chapter, and it definitely needs to be there. But it was just funny because I couldn't even see it when she said it to me. At first I was like, but I have the outline.
Right. It wasn't in my outline.
It wasn't in my outline. Of course, it's the end. So I did add that. And yeah, it was like a different experience, I think, just because I was trying to keep, make sure I stuck to the original text so carefully.
Right.
And I wish I could outline. I mean, do you outline? Because I feel like it was easier when I did it, but then the creativity in my brain did not want to flow that way for what I'm working on now. So I didn't outline.
Yeah. I've never outlined. So, and I can see, I think that every time I start a new book, especially if it's giving me some trouble, I always think I just need to sit down and I need to outline it. If I know where I'm going with it, and I know that I have a twist and all that, then I'll be able to write it. But I think it's the making of the outlines to me that doesn't interest me.
Yeah.
Writing a book interests me.
Right. And then plus, if you know everything is going to happen, like sometimes you get bored. And I feel like I like to surprise myself every morning too.
Yeah. And it's like, I will be writing, and then I'll just, think of something or, a line of dialogue that a character will say. And all of a sudden I see that character in a totally different light, than I did an hour before. And the book goes in a totally different direction. And I love that feeling. That's what gets me so excited about writing, I think. And if I have that all plotted out in advance, then there just isn't that spontaneity.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I have not outlined any of my other novels, and I don't know that I ever will again, but it was a really interesting experience to do it this time around.
Yeah. Well, and the way you were saying earlier, how you went through the Great Gatsby, and you wrote down, they went to Illinois and like the different moves that they made and things like that, or that they lived in Louisville and all that, well, you wanted to make that so accurate. So with this book, I think it would have been practically impossible to do without an outline. So, it's just like whatever the book demands.
What the book dictates. Yeah. What the book dictates, for sure.
Exactly. So we do have one question, I think, that popped up here in our Ask a Question. So I'm going to head over there. Lisa asks, are you planning on writing another book based on historic fiction?
Yes. That's the short answer. I am working on something now that I can't really talk about, but it is sort of another like feminist look at a different classic. So yes, but I can't really tell you about it.
It's always the hardest questions. What are you working on now? Because I know myself, like when you're in the process of writing it, sometimes it's too I don't know, like I want to get all the ideas down, I think, before I share anything about it. And then sometimes even when I'm done, you don't know what's going to change during the revision process. So it's like, you're kind of afraid to talk about it for not knowing what's going to change. But I know that all of your fans are super excited to know that you're writing another one.
Hopefully I'll be able to talk about it more soon. But I mean, I love the, delving into a classic novel and kind of thinking about it in a new light. And obviously I'm always going to be writing something about strong women. I think no matter what I write, if it's young adult or historical fiction or based on another text, or what, that's always going to be in the forefront of my stuff.
For sure. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about like title and cover, because I know that people always like to hear about that. So, okay, for one, this cover, like how, I don't know that my camera's doing it any justice.
Yeah, no, it's perfect.
It is like one of the most gorgeous covers that I have honestly ever seen. So was this the first cover you saw for the book? Did you have any input into it?
Yeah. It was the first cover that I saw for the book. And I didn't really have any input. I think that they asked me, to send them maybe some samples of other covers that I liked. And we did talk about like black and gold and like the Art Deco, but just kind of vaguely. And I am not an artist. So I love when they ask me for, thoughts, but then I can never think of what to tell them because I just can't conceptualize in that way. So I agree. The cover is amazing. I had nothing to do with it. It was the art team at Harper and they did an amazing job. And this was the first cover that they sent me. I don't know if they had other ones that they rejected before, but this was the first one that came my way. And I got to see it pretty early. It was like pretty soon after I finished editing the book, and they sent it. Everybody loved it immediately. And nothing changed on it, which, is kind of rare. I mean, I know for my last book, Half-Life, they sent me a cover and I was like, really did not like the cover that they sent at first. And that book is about Marie Curie, but they had a picture of a different woman on the cover. And so I was like, well, if you're going to use a person, it has to be her, right? Which they were like, yeah, that's a good point. And they actually started over and then they sent me a few other options. And I loved the cover that they came up with, which was totally different. But, sometimes it's like a process to get to that great cover. And sometimes they just show you one and it's amazing. And that's what happened with this one. So I was really lucky. It's stunning. And it's so unique too. Like, I don't feel like I've seen a cover that is similar, it's just, I don't know. It's just absolutely gorgeous. Yeah.
Gold just pops. So
yeah, it's really pretty. They did a great job with it.
It is a process though, because I know, there are so many people involved. And even when you think you have a finished cover, it's like until it's on a bookshelf somewhere, you don't know that someone's not going to decide to change it.
I know that's true, because sometimes like a book buyer or something will not like it and then they start over. And I've definitely like run the gamut with cover experiences, but this was a really great cover experience from the start and a really great cover.
Good. And what about the title, Beautiful Little Fools? Was that your working title or did that come later?
It was. And I always struggle with titles too. So it's very rare for me that I will just have the perfect title right away. I actually had the title before I started the book because it comes from a line from the original Great Gatsby. And it's one of my favorite lines. And Daisy tells her cousin Nick that when her baby was born, she hopes that it's a boy. But then when they tell her it's a girl, she says, well, I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool. So the first thing I knew, and I think I told my agent, was that I'm going to write a book about the women and it's going to be called Beautiful Little Fools. And that was what I knew before anything else. So I had the title the whole time. And I don't think that's happened to me before and probably won't ever happen again. But
yeah, I love it. And so that text there that you just talked about from the Great Gatsby, that's pretty much verbatim in Beautiful Little Fools, right?
Yeah. Because she tells Nick, well, basically when she's giving birth, she says, this is what I said. And so you do see that scene in my book when she gives birth. So she says
so
it.
Do you have to do anything? Do you have to get permission to use quotes like that or no?
No, because the Great Gatsby is in the public domain now, which is why I was able to write this book the way that I did. It came into the public domain, I think, last January 2021. So, if it wasn't, I probably wouldn't have written the book. And that was sort of one of the things that spurred me to do it now. I had the idea for a while. And I had mentioned it to a friend actually a few months before I seriously started working on it, and she loved the idea and made me promise I was going to do it. And I said, well, maybe someday I will. And then I think it was my agent who sent me, and I had mentioned it to my agent too. And then my agent spotted an article, I think it was in USA Today, talking about how the copyright was expiring in a year. And so she said, you have to write this now. Like, this is the right time to do it. So yeah,
it was, I mean, it was perfect timing. And I think, I mean, The Great Gatsby is so hugely popular. And I mean, I think the vast majority of us probably read it in some high school or college class. So, you know, everybody's so familiar with it. And, you know, there was a Leonardo DiCaprio movie not that long ago.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, I think that makes it all the more relatable. And I am curious now that it is in the public domain, how many more books will be coming out, you know, based on Gatsby.
I know. And there have been a few. There was one that came out, and I haven't read any of them because I just was trying to keep my own story in my head, and I'm going to, because I'm really curious, but I haven't yet. There's one called Nick that I think talks about Nick before The Great Gatsby. And then there's another one, The Chosen and the Beautiful, which is about Jordan, but I think it's like a fantasy version of it. So I want to read both of them, but I'm sure there's going to be more too.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have another question over here. Lisa asks, which character was the most challenging to write? It's a great question.
It is a good question. I think Daisy, because we knew the most about her from The Great Gatsby, and she probably has the most dialogue in The Great Gatsby, and she comes off somewhat unsympathetic, I would say, in the original Great Gatsby, but I wanted her to be sympathetic in my novel, you know, and I felt like there was something deeper to her that we weren't getting. So just trying to negotiate that, keeping her true to who she was in The Great Gatsby, but then also making her a character that people would root for in Beautiful Little Fools. And one way I did that was by giving her a sister, Rose. She has a younger sister, Rose, and I don't know if she has a sister based on The Great Gatsby. She's never mentioned if she does. So Rose was totally my invention, but I liked the Myrtle Catherine dynamic, and I thought it would be cool to balance out Daisy with a sister as well. And then the book feels a little like it's about sisterhood and female friendship too. So adding, like, when I figured out Rose and added her into the equation, I think that helped me figure out Daisy's character more.
Yeah, for sure. And Daisy's one of those characters that I feel like you want her to have like more backbone. You want her to like stand up for herself, you know, but then when you step back and think of the circumstances and the time period, and, you know, it's not the present time, you know, things are very much different. And you do, I mean,
her husband is awful. You know, he cheats on her honeymoon, and then for some reason they have to move away from Chicago extremely quickly because of his little spree, as she mentions in the book. And so, you know, I imagine all of that, but he's pretty awful. And she tells him she wants East Egg to be her permanent home, and then he's like immediately cheating on her with Myrtle. So I really I had to really think about how I could make her relatable. And so she was probably the most challenging to write, but you know, in the end, I really liked her a lot too. And I think the first time I read The Great Gatsby in high school, I really thought of it as a love story. I don't know about you, but that's how it sat in my head. And then when I reread it again when I was older, I really didn't see it as a love story anymore. I think Nick, who's the narrator in the original, presents it as a love story. You know, he's sort of enamored with Gatsby. He's enamored with Gatsby's love for Daisy. But when you think about it as an adult woman and you think, okay, here's this man she dated 5 years earlier, and she moves into this new house in Long Island, and he buys the house across the sound from her so he can stare at her. 5 years later, after she already told him she didn't want to be with him, it felt so stalkery to me. And I thought, this is not romantic at all.
Totally.
So I just tried to think about, you know, what it would have been like for her as a woman in that time, in a bad marriage. At first, she might have thought the attention was nice, and then it might have become a little much from her point of view.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I want to go back and read The Great Gatsby, but I think that after reading Beautiful Little Fools, I will just automatically see it in a totally different light. You know, like feeling now that I have this other perspective of each of these female characters, then I think it would be a totally different read. But I think it would be a very cool read too. You know, I have this like alternate life of these women. Your writing is like it's the kind of writing, well, it makes for effortless reading, which I know is not effortless writing, but just, I mean, you just have a way with your writing and I don't know, your words and it's beautiful. And I know that at events like this, there are always a number of writers and aspiring writers. So do you have advice for people who are either working on a novel or, just any kind of tips that you have for writers out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned earlier, the one thing I always say is to write the story that you want to read. And I think it's important that you just truly love what you're doing and, not to try to write to a trend or write to what you think other people would want to read, but just like write something that you really love yourself. And then the other thing I always say is to read widely in the area where you're writing, to see what's out there, to see what other people are doing. And then the most basic tip is just butt in chair. And a professor of mine in grad school always used to say that. And it's so simplistic, but you just have to sit down to write. You could always think of something else to do that would be easier. I know I can. And you can revise bad words, but you can't revise no words. So you just have to sit down and put the words on the page if you want to write a book.
Yeah, that's great. That's good advice. Yeah, it's amazing, like the number of distractions that I can find for myself when I'm supposed to be writing. And I think too, because like we're on a computer, so the internet is right there. All sorts of things we can, navigate to instead of
research, but then, you find some other stuff there too.
Right. And then you're like, oh, better just check Facebook.
Yeah.
So I probably should have asked this way earlier, but is writing the thing that you always wanted to do? Did you want to be a writer from the time you were young, or is it something that you kind of came to a little bit later?
Yeah, I mean, I did, but I sort of came and went from it. I was always a really big reader. Like from when I was very young, elementary school, I was just reading all the time. I was constantly begging my mom to take me to the library, and you could only check out 10 books. That was the limit. So I would check out 10 and I would read them really fast. And then I would beg her to take me back so I could check out 10 more. So I was always reading. And, when I was younger, I did used to write a lot of very bad poetry, very bad poetry. And I kind of went away from it a little bit in high school. I thought I was going to, major in the science field. I took a lot of science classes in high school, and I took human anatomy in 11th grade, and we had to dissect a cat, which was the worst experience of my life. I'm a cat person. Yeah. So after that, that was the end of my very short medical career, 11th grade. And then, I kind of started to find my way back to writing. I decided I was going to major in English in college, but I thought that I was going to be a journalist, and actually I worked for my college paper for a little bit, and I had an internship with the paper after my sophomore year in college. And I just was really bored. And I realized that was not the kind of writing that I liked. I was, working at this paper, and I kept thinking it would be so much fun to write something if I could just invent these characters and I didn't have to actually write what happened. And then I took my first fiction class. I think when I was a junior in college, I took a fiction writing class, and then I realized that's the kind of writing that I wanted to do. That's what was drawing me to this English major. So it was, I would say, from the time I was in my early 20s, I seriously knew that I wanted to be a writer.
Yeah. Yeah. So then how did you go from wanting to be a writer to getting published and finding an agent and all that? What was that process like?
Oh, that's a long story. So I got my MFA after college. So I went to graduate school, and I wrote a novel for my MFA thesis. And then, I was teaching at the time too. I was teaching college English, and I graduated. I was still teaching college English, and I was trying to find an agent for my novel. And I never did. I think I got 150 agent rejections. They were all very nice, and everybody liked my writing, but they didn't want to represent me. So I wrote another novel and kind of went through the same thing. I was sending it out for a few years and could not get an agent. And then I actually put it aside for a little bit, and I had a baby. And when my oldest, who just turned 17 this week, he was about a year, and he was just starting to talk. And I thought, all of a sudden one day in a panic, I was like, he's going to ask me what I do, and I'm going to have to tell him that I wanted to be a writer, and I failed. And so I dusted off the novel again, and I I was like, I'm just going to do one more round of agent queries. And then that's when I actually connected with my agent, who I still have today. So she read it and reached out and really liked it at that point. Actually, I think I revised the book again before I sent it out. And so, yeah, it was kind of a long road. And then it took her like a year and a half to sell that book too. So it was not easy for sure.
And was the first one was it a YA book or was it Margot?
It was a YA book. I had written it as an adult book, but it had a teenage narrator, and my agent was trying to sell it as an adult book, and it wouldn't, we couldn't sell it. And you know what it's like when you try to sell a book, and everyone was saying like, this is a great story, but we just published a book with the teenage narrator. So it's just stuff like that. And so my agent was like, you know what, I'm going to send it out to a few young adult editors. And then I actually sold it in an auction, although I had to revise it at that point, because at that point my editor was like, this feels like an adult book, which it wasn't an adult book. So that became my first book, and it was a young adult book. And then I did come back, and I did write Margot a few years later.
Okay. Oh, that's such a good story. Okay. We have another question here. And if anybody has any other questions, be sure to push them in the chat down there. The question is F. Scott Fitzgerald one of your favorite authors?
Yeah, I mean, I would say The Great Gatsby is one of my favorite novels for sure, but I'm not as big of a fan of his other books. So I don't know that I would say he's one of my favorite authors. The Great Gatsby is definitely one of my favorite novels. And I don't know what it is about that novel. I just think there's something about it that like really interests me more than some of his other stuff.
Yeah. I don't think that I've read anything else by Fitzgerald, to be honest.
Yeah, I think I read like one or two others when I was in college, and it sort of like blends together. I remember I was reading Hemingway in that class, and they sort of all blend together, other than The Great Gatsby, which is super memorable to me.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's see. We've got another question coming in. What are your other favorite novels?
Oh, that's a good question. I have so many favorite novels that I'm not even gonna be able to think of where to start. I would say like Stephen King has been an enduring favorite writer of mine from when I was young, and I read all of his horror novels as a teenager too. I love some of the historical stuff that he's done more recently, and will still read him. Alice Hoffman, I've read all her novels, over time. Always love her. In terms of classics, I would say I read a lot of classics in college, and there were a lot of them that I didn't love. And, I think The Great Gatsby was one of the classics that I truly loved, which is why it stuck with me. I really did not like Moby Dick. I know I'm probably like not supposed to say that as a writer, but that was one of my most hated classics. And then, I read a lot of like varied stuff. I don't read historical fiction when I'm writing historical fiction, just because I feel like it's too confusing to like get a different time period in my head. So I read a lot of like domestic thrillers, like Mary. I love Mary's books. I'll read romance. I'll read young adult. I'll read a little bit of nonfiction here and there. I can tell you what I'm reading now. I'm prepared for that question. I'm reading The Husbands by Chandler Baker. I don't know if have you read that, Mary?
I haven't, no.
It's really interesting. It's kind of like the Stepford Wives, but the husbands are the Stepford Wives. And so it's like a really interesting concept.
That sounds really good.
Through that. Yeah. So that's really good.
That sounds really good. Okay, so my last question for you, and then if anybody has any last questions, be sure to pop them in the box.
Yeah.
But I was just going to ask, this is always a hard question, but do you have a favorite of the books that you've written, or do you have like a favorite time period in history that is your favorite to write about?
I feel like whenever I get this question, I always say the most recent book. And I do really feel that way. I always feel like my most recent usually is my favorite, probably just because it's the freshest and the most exciting. But I also feel like if I stop feeling that way, I haven't written the right next book, because I hope that I'm always like growing and doing something a little more exciting than I did with the last book. I would say like reader favorite of all my books is probably The Lost Letter. That's what I hear about, the most through time. But if you ask me now, I would say Beautiful Little Fools. If you ask me in a year from now, I probably have a different answer.
The next book, right? Yeah. Well, they're just, I mean, they're all phenomenal. I can't say that enough. Margot was the first book of yours that I read, and I've read all of your books, and I just love them all. Like, they're all so beautifully done. And I mean, I think you just do something, the way that you reimagine these stories. You do something that really no other author does. I mean, and you have a way with your words, and you completely immerse me in these stories, and I fall in love with all of your characters. And Beautiful Little Fools, I can't pick a favorite myself, but Beautiful Little Fools is at the top of the list. And it's just so phenomenal. And so for all of you out there that haven't gotten a copy yet, make sure that you do get a copy. Stop by Barbara's Bookstore.
Yeah, and I think that they have book plates if people want signed copies too.
Yeah.
So you should be able to get that from Barbara's.
Fantastic. So, and you will all love it. And follow Jillian on social media so you can get information about her next release.
All right. Thank you so much for doing this, Mary. And I have Local Woman Missing sitting right here, which I love. So if you haven't read Local Woman Missing yet, you really should pick it up, or all of Mary's books.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we're all very excited to hear more and read your next book when you're ready to share it with us.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks to everyone who joins us tonight.
Yeah. Thank you for everyone.